I want to welcome you to this lecture on the shared responsibility model. So one of the things that we're talking about in the class for this particular course and when we're looking at risk is that shared responsibility model and how that shared responsibility model actually functions and how it will work with what you need to be able to prove or show as you go through and do your information security process. So the shared responsibility model, basically for all of our providers, is basically a cloud security framework that dictates the security obligations of the cloud computing provider or the cloud service provider and its users to ensure accountability. That's the nuts and bolts definition of this whole thing. It's just basically who's responsible for what when it comes down to how we're going to secure systems, data, infrastructure, right? So everybody has a different viewpoint of it. So everyone's a little bit different. So we're going to take a look at our four major providers today. We're going to look at Google, Amazon, Azure, and Alibaba Cloud. Odds are highly likely you're going to intersect with one or more of these depending on where you are in the world. For example, Alibaba Cloud is really popular in China, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. They also have the best data centers in the Middle East. While Amazon and Microsoft are growing out their data centers, odds are highly likely you're going to intersect with Alibaba Cloud if you want to provision in the Middle East. Seriously, that's just how this market looks at, and that's why we're going to bring all four of them in, right? So when we take a look at Google, Google uses a shared responsibility matrix. And basically that's based on what kind of service you get from Google, right? So if you're on-prem, you are responsible for everything. It's your data center. You're responsible for all the data center configurations. You're responsible for all the data center certifications and making sure that your data center meets certain things. If you're doing SaaS, software as a service, then you're only responsible for the content and the access policies. Everything else becomes the process of how Google will do that work for you. So depending on which service you use, Google is responsible for whatever specific segment of that service that the customer uses, right? So depending on how much control you need, depends on how much stuff Google would be responsible for in this. What makes this interesting, though, is that Google actually has a really robust shared security model, and they actually make a lot of their documentation very legal. So I'm going to go ahead and bring over some of their documentation here and make this a little bit bigger so it's a little bit easier to read. So when you go through and you take a look at your PCI DSS responsibility matrix and how Google takes a look at it, right? So description, segment 1.1, Google's internal production network, but here's what the customer is responsible for. Right. So while Google will say that internal production network and systems have been assessed against and comply against this requirement, as the customer, as part of that shared responsibility model, you are responsible for implementing the processes and procedures necessary to ensure that all network connections, inbound and outbound traffic and blah, 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 are yours. You take care of that. So Google's taking care of the infrastructure. You're taking care of everything above that. And that's where this whole process of the shared model actually comes really into place. And it's a good way of taking a look at it because specific frameworks can help define additional parts of the process. So you may want to do PCI DSS, but do you need to do SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley, or do you need to do something else? So again, you can go through all these documentations and help you come up with the controls that you need to have for your specific responsibility and the things that you want to do on your network, right? These are also defined by the Google Security Principles that go along with this shared responsibility model, right? So you are determining and control what happens to your data at all levels, right? Whether you're doing in-center data, you're doing a PAS, an IAS, or a SAS, the data is yours. You are looking at defense in depth at scale by default. So you're going to have the right user permissions through user provisioning. You're going to have the right technical controls in place to make sure data segregation happens and data lifecycle systems happen and data access things happen and all those other processes that go along with it. You're going to identify the perimeter where you're supported by the hardware attestation and provenance, which is what we just looked at. Move your security policy, controls, and enforcement up the stack, so that as you go through, you are working in that whole process where you have as many controls in place as possible to make sure the data is not misused or taken accidentally or taken by hacking. Right? Transparency, reduce the unverifiable trust service. A lot of people are going with a zero trust model right now, which is really good. I'm not going to trust anybody for any reason. And then customers have the control and visibility they need to help build secure apps and businesses in the cloud. And that's the big one. Not only are you responsible for your data, but if you're in a platform or infrastructure, you're responsible for your software as well, right? You're not in a managed service. So if you're running that database, if you're running MySQL or MS SQL or whatever, and you're not part of the managed service, you are responsible for all the patching and updating and everything else that goes along with that database system. So that's how Google takes a look at their shared responsibility model. Amazon is basically the same way, right? Again, security and compliance, shared responsibility between AWS, Amazon, and the customer. A shared model, help relieve the customer's burden because blah, right? So they're saying that they're going to take responsibility for components from the host operating system and virtualization layer on down to the physical security of the facilities in which the service operates, right? But the customer assumes the responsibility for management of the guest operating systems, updates, patches, anything else, depending on what they get. They are also responsible for their firewalls, they're responsible for their data lifecycle, they're responsible for their access and authorizations to that data. So if you leave your S3 bucket globally open so that anyone who comes along can just read it, and there's a really interesting Google hack, if you haven't seen that, to find all the open buckets on the Amazon cloud, then that's your responsibility. They will come down as they run their audits, and they will let you know that you have an open global writable or just read-only directory. But yeah, because there's different ways of doing it. But that's that customer responsibility. You're responsible for that data and the security and protection of that data as it goes along. They do the same thing depending on what service you buy or use as Google does, and you'll find that Amazon does the same thing, and Azure and Alibaba, they all do the same thing. That the more control you need to have over systems, the more control you do, but the more responsibility you take for those systems. So if you're buying Amazon EC2s, you are responsible for your data, your platform application management, the network, firewalls, configurations, traffic protection, server-side encryption, and all that other stuff. But if you're buying a managed service, like S3, AWS, ArcKMS, or DynamoDB, then you're only responsible for the data and the client-side data encryption, right? So you're still responsible for things, but your responsibility moves around this graphic depending on what service you buy and how you want to manage or what kind of control you need to have over your systems, because you will always have control over your data, right? And again, it's just that whole process of data. So in a nutshell, right, that Amazon is primarily responsible for everything that you see here, the software, the hardware, global infrastructure, compute, storage, database, and you'll find that Alibaba is about the same graphic here, right, which is interesting. But the big one on the customer, though, is really that customer data, and you are responsible for that all the time. And depending on what you get to be responsible for other things as part of the shared responsibility model. So AWS does have artifact reports, much like what you saw with Google, but you can't share that report. They actually put right across the report not to be shared in public for any reason whatsoever. So AWS Artifact is a great place to find all of your reports and compliance reports and other things that you would need if you go through a PCI DSS audit or SOX or whatever, SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3 type reports, HIPAA, high trust. They'll all be there underneath the AWS Artifact. So that's a good place to go find your stuff. If you can get into the console, go take a look at artifact reports. Just remember, you can't share them. AWS Security Principles. And in a nutshell, right, security in cloud, AWS is responsible for protecting the infrastructure that runs all of the services offered in the cloud. Boom. The customer, you'll notice you have a lot bigger sense of responsibilities here for security in the cloud. Customer responsibility will be determined by the AWS cloud services that the customer selects. The more managed the service, the less responsible you are, except for your data and encryption, your encryption, all the way down to you're responsible for everything but that layer that Amazon's always going to be responsible for. So you do really kind of want to take a look at that process, how it works and why it works the way they do, and then make that decision on how you want to configure and stack your AWS along the way. Azure, same kind of idea, right? And that you are more worried about data classification in Azure, right? You still have things that Azure is responsible for, not a problem, and it's always at that virtualization layer on down. But they really do rely on that classification model. And I think that's interesting how they will do this between sensitive customer data, things that would be covered by HIPAA or high trust, things that will be covered under something else, PCI DSS or GDPR or whatever, right? So you're either got banking or privacy or medical or however it wants to be. You're responsible for that. And that data classification is really how they focus their shared responsibility model. Same kind of concepts though. The more managed service you get, the less you're responsible for. The more things that you need to have control over, the more you are responsible for. So the thing that I find interesting though is that Azure adds devices, mobile and PCs, into that SaaS model, right? And that you are responsible for the people that connect to your system, your devices and your PCs. They're the only people that make that distinction, right? Amazon doesn't come out and say it as directly, neither does Google, neither does Alibaba. So that's a neat difference, right? That's really easily pointed out by all this responsibility and varying by types and how those are shared along the board, inventory and a directory infrastructure, applications, network control. So if you're running a really scary application that's kind of really weak and something that's got a lot of vulnerabilities in it, they will talk to you about that application and why that's probably not the best thing to have on that network. So they will go back and review. All of these companies have some way of validating your code to make sure it meets industry best practices for code development, which is another good part to have as part of this whole process. You get a lot of tools that you wouldn't otherwise have access to in your company, which is really nice, right? So again, the Azure shared responsibility model really is taking a look at your data, your endpoints, your account, and your access management. So regardless of where you are, these are always the things you are going to be responsible for. And again, boils down to data, who can access it, and why can they access it. And then when you get into certification of the things, so you can actually go through and pull up their certifications like you could with Google Cloud, right? So it's really kind of neat. You can actually go through and pull down their certifications and see what they're certified for and what they've actually got on the books. So if you need to have these, go grab them, right? These are really interesting documents to go take a look at, especially from that idea of here's where I'm certified, here's how this works, this is why this is a good thing, and then we can kind of move from there. Alibaba, same kind of concepts, right? Alibaba wants to secure the infrastructure, their data centers, they're deployed, but you are responsible for your configurations, your data, your endpoints, ensure basic security and data security for your business in the cloud. You are absolutely 100% responsible for your own data, your own encryption, and all the other things. And again, depending on what service you buy, the more things that you are responsible for or less things you are responsible for. So Alibaba Cloud actually does a lot more in the managed service space, which is interesting. They give some really good managed services along the way, which makes them a really strong competitor in a lot of ways in those markets. But you are always going to be responsible for your data, again, your application, any extra virtual machines, any virtual networks. Make sure your ACLs are good, your NACLs are good. Make sure your user accounts are good, and all those other things that would go along with it. Alibaba Cloud Security Services will help you along the way across all the layers of this shared responsibility model. So it does make things a little bit easier for you, that you can actually, like with anybody else, actually tap into the security services, but they make a distinction in calling out their security services along all the layers that you would be responsible for. So in this model, customers retain control, maintenance, and ownership of member content. That's your data. Customers also determine where their content will be located and control and format because they're primarily a Chinese company. Chinese data needs to stay in China. It's that simple. So there you go. You can actually control where it will be located a little bit easier because they're built around geofencing data, right? Then you also want to determine whether they'll select a managed service or if you're going to go full on and build your own process. Right. Again, they're going to try to push the managed service because from their viewpoint, that's more safe. But you may need to build out your own special hierarchy. You may need to have your own databases and your own web servers and all those other things. So it's really kind of up to you. You're going to be working within the lifecycle management portion of the whole thing. Alibaba also does really, really good on sharing out their data center certification process. This is again for PCI DSS. Just easy. Everybody knows what PCI DSS is all about. So again, they actually go through and they will break it down to how each system on the managed side and on the service side breaks down into each of those services and how they were assessed for compliance in the process of scope verification. Right, so these are also really good. You can pull down these reports from Alibaba, not a problem. They're great to look at. So essentially, for all four providers, right, essentially the same security model across the board. All right, you're responsible for your data. You're responsible for access and lifestyle. Those are all the responsibility of the customer. The CSP, the cloud service provider, is responsible for the data center, the networks, and things like that come in, right? But you then, as you buy or use different services, it gives you kind of a difference in terms of latitude and control over the data and systems you've got, depending on what kind of service you buy. So it's pretty flexible, but you are always responsible for your data, and you are always responsible for your encryption schema. Outside of that, you can negotiate that whole process along the way with what kind of service that you buy from any one of these service providers. They all basically offer the same thing, just to a different degree or to a different flavor or to a different viewpoint. But they all really do have different things. They look a lot alike, but they all run a little bit differently. But they're really easy to kind of manage. So if you're doing a dual system, if you're doing, I've got some stuff in a Google Cloud, I got some stuff in Amazon Cloud, this is what makes it easy. That shared responsibility model allows that back and forth a lot easier. It makes it a lot more transportable in terms of how your data runs, or whether you're going to use Google to data mine your data and you're going to use Amazon to service customers, or however you want to do it. It does make things a lot more easier for you in the long run to understand how all four of these providers have that really similar shared security model. So if you have any questions, always let me know. I'm more than happy to answer anything you've got about the cloud. Happy to be here on that one. But definitely do take a look at this, and do go back and take a look at those documents. In that shared security model, it's a real simple search on these things. The documents are interesting to take a look at, and it should really help you understand how to build a risk matrix around these services, knowing what you're responsible for, depending on what kind of service you buy. Right? If you go with a SaaS solution, if you go with one of their data center or their data warehousing or data lake solutions, that's managed. It's really just about your data and your whatever encryption schema you use, your data system lifecycle rules, and who's got access to it and when. So again, really straightforward, good to understand these. And again, do let me know if you've got any questions about it. And thank you very much. I'll see you in the next lecture.